on this computer. We're ready to go. You going to do an intro, or do you want me to just start?
We did the intro while we were getting ready, Mark.
All right. So I'm going to start with share screen. So I will be minimized. You'll be able to see. I need, Bill, I need you to enable screen sharing as well.
We like your background.
I used to live in Texas, so I loved it.
Okay. Okay, I think it doesn't show you have screen saving available.
Yeah, I think we're all fine right now. Let's start that. Let's get this puppy going. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah.
I want to make it bigger here in a second. How's that? Okay, I'm Dr. Mark Holacek. I've got my dog Jefferson sitting on top of my computer as well. You want to say hi, Jeff? Here's my little buddy here, named after the former president. I start off with two of the books, each of which will sell for an autographed copy for $30 with shipping. I have three of the one on the left, five of the one on the right. The one on the left was my second book on Jefferson out of the 27 that I've written. It's a critique of all the people, all the pro-Jefferson people. As a philosopher and a logician for 30 years, I was able to look at the arguments of the pro-Jefferson, Jefferson as father of Sally Hemings, and destroy them rather piecemeal. And that's the book that got me blacklisted, to start things off on the wrong end. The second one came out recently, and my talk today is going to be mostly focused on the second book. It's a critical analysis. All right, so the talk is titled Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, A Money Spinning Myth. In 2018, June of 2018, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation claimed that they found Sally Hemings' room. This intrigued me. And they made a big deal about it. And they made a big deal about it because they were drawing upon one sentence that Thomas Jefferson's grandson uttered to some people. And from that one sentence, they were able to locate Sally Hemings' room and clean it up. And not long after, they claimed that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, which was a puzzling claim, as you're going to see, because there's really no evidence for it. So why was it crucial to find this room of Sally? It bothered me. I think because on the tours that they were given at Monticello, there was always this talk of Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, and someone came up with the idea, in my estimation, of, well, if we create this room, then we have concrete evidence. For any of the doubters will say, well, how do we know this really happened? We can always say, here's the room. We have physical evidence. And secondly, what this does for the Jefferson bashers, the Jefferson calumniators, it creates a contrast. It shows Thomas Jefferson living sumptuously in Monticello, eating good food, living in comfort, and his mistress, the one who's good enough to be his sex object, but not his wife, lives in squalor. So, all right, Leslie Bowman, who was the president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at the time, talked about this new exhibit to Sally Hemings, June 2018. The foundation will henceforth assert what the evidence indicate and eliminate qualifying language with respect to Eston Hemings, the last child of Jefferson, presumably of Jefferson Sally Hemings, the last child of Sally Hemings, right? What does this mean? Here are the children of Sally Hemings. I cross out Thomas first in 1790 because there's no evidence that there was such a person other than hearsay. There was a Harriet that was born in 1795 and died quickly. Beverly, we know she was born. We don't know when she died because she left Monticello. She went somewhere we don't know. Presumably another one. Then Harriet, same story with Beverly, Harriet Hemings. Madison, he's a very, very important figure because in 1873, he's going to give a testimony in the Pike County Republican newspaper saying, Thomas Jefferson was my father. And we're going to find out there are all sorts of problems with this presentation. And then lastly, Eston. We talked about Eston as being, there as part of the 1998 DNA study. And I'll talk about that next. So the case for HTJ means the hypothesis Thomas Jefferson. The hypothesis Thomas Jefferson is the hypothesis that Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. All of these children you see here were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to see why that claim is abundantly problematic. Now, the physical evidence. In 1998, there was a DNA study. All right. Eugene Foster was a geneticist who spearheaded the study. There were two other geneticists, the pathologist, the statistician, and a biochemist. What they looked at, for those of you familiar with genetics, they looked at just Y chromosomal DNA. The Y chromosome is what makes a offspring a male. When an Y chromosome mixes with an X, we get a male. When we have two X's, we get a female. When we study DNA, the Y chromosome in every male is identical in the family. In other words, my Y chromosome is identical with my father's. It's identical with my two brothers. Any male offspring in the family will have the same Y chromosome. So that's an important thing, because if we can find, for example, if we did a DNA sample of Jefferson and got his Y chromosome, anybody who had the Jefferson Y chromosome would be in the male line. Okay, so what the study showed is that the last child in the purple, Eston, there was a male line offspring somewhere down the line, which showed that Eston had the Jefferson Y chromosome. Now, what does that mean? There's only one sample done. So if there's anything that's screwed up, that's problematic. That sample showed that Eston, the descendant of Eston, had the Y chromosome, and presumably, if there's no tainting in the line, that Eston himself was fathered by Thomas Jefferson or someone in Jefferson's line. It could be a Jefferson's brother Randolph. It could be one of Randolph's four sons, or anyone else in the male line. There are some 22 candidates. The people, Foster in the DNA study, concluded the molecular findings provide evidence that he, Jefferson, was the biological father of Eston. So from this sample, which only shows that Jefferson could have been the father, these people conclude that Jefferson was the father. Now, notice their title on the top in Nature. This was a barn burner. Jefferson fathered slave's last child. Now, it doesn't say a Jefferson, it says Jefferson, which seems to point out Thomas Jefferson. Every historian on the planet, few of them believe that Thomas Jefferson fathered any of Hemings' children. All of them did a 180, and Thomas Jefferson was implicated because of this study. And as we can see, the study doesn't show what it claims to show. It only shows Jefferson could be the father if the data were not tainted in any way. There's no reason to think the data were tainted. Okay, so they have a misleading title. They provide the conclusion that Jefferson was the most likely candidate. No other person seems to be reasonable, which we'll see is not the case. Now, the historical evidence, the evidence that the historians have garnered for us. I'm going to look at Madison Hemings. We go back to Madison Hemings. He was the second from the last, the penultimate child. He was born in 1805. He comes out in 1873, some 50 years after the death of Thomas Jefferson, and says, Thomas Jefferson is my father, was my father. Right? Now, this is the newspaper clipping. You see Life Among the Lowly. This comes out 50 years after Jefferson's death. In a number of years, Why doesn't Madison say anything? He's in Chillicothe, Ohio. Why has he not said anything before this time? Right? Presumably, this account he gives, he talks about he never really learned to read and write, but he picked it up on his own. And yet, if you read this carefully, it's pretty well written. It's clear he didn't write it. James Wetmore, who was the editor of this newspaper, this is the first of Life Among the Lowly after Harriet Beecher Stowe, to resuscitate a newspaper that's dying. This is a bombshell story, and it's meant to be. It's filled with half-truths, some truths, and some out lies. He says John Wales was the father. John Wales was the father of Jefferson's wife. He comes out and says John Wales was the father of Sally Hemings, a slave. Now, that's probably true. We have some DNA evidence that supports that, which shows that Jefferson's wife was the half-sister of Sally Hemings. That much I concede. It seems to be reasonable. He says Jefferson went to France from 1784 to 1789 as minister plenipotentiary to France, as a minister who was entitled to make all sorts of treaties with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And he says when Sally Hemings, he gets there at 1784, one of his daughters dies. Jefferson panics, wants the youngest daughter, Maria, who was 8 at the time, who's at the death, she's 6. He wants her brought to France to be with him. So this is in 1786. Later, he brings Maria Jefferson, Mary Jefferson, changed her name Maria in France, and Sally Hemings, unbeknown to Thomas Jefferson, comes with her, right? And at the time, Sally Hemings is 14, and we're going to see Abigail Adams said she's highly mature. And presumably Jefferson, who is 30 years older than Sally Hemings, she's 14, 34, immediately falls in love with this 14-year-old slave, according to the story given by, this is a very important piece because the entire case for Monticello rests on this testimony. We'll come back to that. Says Jefferson, Sally Hemings got pregnant by Jefferson in France, right? He says the child didn't live long on her return to Virginia. That's the infamous Thomas you see with the cross out, born in presumably in 1780. Now, this guy named Thomas Woodson claimed to be an offspring of Thomas Jefferson Hemings, Thomas Hemings Jefferson. They did DNA study with Thomas Woodson. They found out he did not have the Jefferson Y chromosome, so we can be, he was not the father of this child. Now, what is worse is we don't have any evidence that there was a child other than this testimony in something in James' calendar. So, you know, whether she becomes pregnant by Thomas Jefferson, I suspect this is just a lie. And then Thomas had the other children. He says all the other children are fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Now, we don't have any biological data for Beverly, Harriet, or Madison. We only have one piece of biological evidence to confirm the Y chromosome, okay? Now, the second bit is Annette Gordon Reed, who is an African-American scholar who publishes a book in 1977, 1 year prior to the DNA study. And in that book, she claims that Jefferson could have, notice, doesn't say was the father, could have been the father of some of Hemings' children. And anybody who denies the claim is racist, right? Notice what she says here in purple. Now, Madison Hemings' testimony is hearsay. It would not pass in a criminal court because he's talking about events prior to his birth, so he didn't witness them. They count for nothing. She says Madison Hemings' memoirs, that essay, must stand or fall on the basis of his credibility alone. To that end, it must be said that these memoirs are properly described as items of direct evidence that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were involved. What is she saying here? That secondary evidence must be primary evidence. That circumstantial evidence must be taken as first-person eyewitness evidence. How do you do that? How do I take hearsay and make it direct evidence? She's just saying we have to do that. Why? Because if you don't, you're a racist. If you don't, you're disavowing the testimony because Madison Hemings was Black. She goes on to say that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were in love when Jefferson stayed in France at Hotel de Languedoc, Jefferson's residence, which was filled with people. Sally Hemings stayed with him, not with his daughter at the convent, at the Abbaye Royale de Pontemont. So it's reasonable that if she's there to watch over Maria, she would stay with Maria. She says, following the testimony that she stayed at Jefferson's. Now, why does she say that? On what evidence? Zero evidence for that. Why does she say that? Because she's got to get her story off the ground that she got pregnant, right? It's hard for her to get pregnant if she's going to be at the convent. No evidence that she stayed with Jefferson. I suspect this is another lie that's spun. Jefferson falls madly in love, trying to win her affection. Remember, she's 14. And you're talking about one of the most important, significant people in the world. Why would he fall in love with a child? She also mentioned she was Jefferson's chambermaid at Monticello. That claim is not true. All right. She says a bunch of other silly things that when Jefferson was president in Washington, why didn't he bring Sally Hemings? Because that would have caused all sorts of complications, not the least of them cute babies running around who just look just like him, right? Maybe there's a simpler explanation. He didn't father any kids. He had no interest in her, so he didn't bring her to Washington. That's why. Simple explanation. Notice what she says. So I call this racism, where she's using race as leverage, right? The rejection of the Sally Hemings story can be seen as a denial of Black ties to the founding of the nation and a rejection of Black birthright claims. What an outstandingly ridiculous claim. I'm a Ukrainian by blood, not born in Ukraine, but my grandparents were. And my line is completely Ukrainian for all I know, if there is a complete Ukraine bloodline. My ancestors were not involved in the founding of this country. That doesn't make me less of a citizen. She's claiming that unless we have an affair between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, then Blacks don't have a claim to the founding of the nation. But clearly, if I were a Black person, I would be embarrassed by this claim. She says white historians before her work treat Blacks as lumps of clay to be fashioned and molded into whatever image the given historian feels is necessary to make a point. Last point. Why is she writing this? Because if the relationship is true, Sally Hemings, and these are her words, gets some measure of power over Jefferson. Jefferson, and these are her words, is cut down to size. So she has a mission to destroy Thomas Jefferson, clearly, right? Bringing up someone who was more than likely an unlettered and ignorant, probably a very beautiful young lady, but ignorant. And Jefferson's going to fall in love with her. I doubt it, but she's in there to cut him down to size. Now notice everything I've done here with Gordon Reed, with the testimony. This is all indirect evidence. She's a historian. She has no direct testimony here. So we have to take this in Latin cum grano salis, with a grain of salt. Okay, I talked about this. Now, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, they have embraced Gordon Reed with open arms. They love her. By the way, I am banned from Monticello because I have attacked them critically in the two books you've seen. And I have been blacklisted from Monticello. Of my 27 books, I told Bill, not one is for sale at Monticello. The vice president told me, Mark, and I quote him, "You do not dig in the same garden as the rest of us." In other words, you don't buy into the Sally Hemings story. You respect Thomas Jefferson. You don't call him a hypocrite and a racist and a bigot, because he was none of those things. It's a political game at Monticello. So the first thing they do is saying Madison Hemings' claim, which is indirect testimony, is truthful. Like Gordon Reed, they follow it to the letter, which to me is very dangerous because it's politicized and because it's indirect evidence. And they have many different claims. I'm not going to read them all. The third one, Madison Hemings was described by a U.S. Census taker as the son of Thomas Jefferson in 1870. He lived in Chillicothe. Well, so what? If Madison Hemings, while in Chillicothe, was asked by the census taker, right? As if he told them that he was the son of Jefferson, then it's going to be described, sure. A newspaper accounts in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1887 and 1902 recalled that Eston Hemings resembled Thomas Jefferson. Now, there is an account by Thomas Jefferson's grandson that acknowledges that Eston resembled Thomas Jefferson. And I take that seriously. Thomas Jefferson's grandfather acknowledged that, and his grandson acknowledged that, and said, it's funny because some people he'd invite to the table and Eston would be serving, and Eston looked a lot like Thomas. Thomas never objected to it. It just didn't bother him at all, presumably because he knew he wasn't the father. Now, that could easily be explained, for example, if Jefferson's brother Randolph, and I think Randolph, I'll show you later, was the father of Eston. That's why he has the Y chromosome. There's some evidence for that, direct testimony for that, right? The evidence against the hypothesis that Thomas Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. All right. Now, I have on the top right, you see H, D. That means historical evidence and direct testimony. These are testimonies from people who are eyewitnesses. And while Jefferson was president in 1805, Thomas Walker, who was a friend, had left for some negotiation with Native American Indians and asked Jefferson to watch over his wife and child at the time. And presumably, Jefferson, when he was very young, prior to being married, made a pass at his wife. Now, I think that really did happen because he acknowledges it. Levi Lincoln, who was part of his cabinet, as part of a cover letter, Jefferson writes, "You will perceive that I plead guilty to one of their charges," the people who calumniate him, "that when young and single, I offered love to a handsome lady. I acknowledge its correctness." Now, if we read this carefully, this could also be taken to be the one and only one that of all the charges, if he's going to fess up to this, own up to this, if he's charged with being the lover of Sally Hemings, why wouldn't he say, yeah, I am? He's being truthful here. Of all the charges against me, this is the only one, right? Now, to what extent, there's a lot to this. We don't know to what extent Thomas Walker's wife, Betsy, was complicit. For the most part, at the time, it was standard practice to protect the woman's reputation. So the man, if there was any indiscretion involved, the man would take full blame. How do we know that Betsy didn't initiate the offer? Maybe she did, maybe Thomas did. We just don't know. All I'm saying is we can't assume that Thomas Jefferson is blameworthy and blameworthy alone. But he does admit to this. That is some evidence that he doesn't say anything else. So it's some evidence that he didn't have an affair with Sally Hemings. Now, Edmund Bacon in 1862, he was the overseer on the bottom line. 1806 to 1822, he was the overseer at Monticello. Concerning Sally Hemings' daughter, Harriet, the number 5 on the chart, he says she was not his daughter, Thomas's daughter. She was Blake's. That was crossed out. I know that I've seen him come out of her mother's room many a morning when I went up to Monticello very early. So here we have eyewitness testimony, maybe only from 1806 to 1822, prior to the birth of Harriet, of someone consistently going to see Sally Hemings and making love to her. And, since he's only there from 1806, probably this behavior had been occurring prior to that as well. So we have direct testimony here of someone witnessing someone being, other than Jefferson, being of Sally Hemings' lover. Abigail Adams, 1787. Remember, Jefferson in Paris. He brings his daughter Maria on the bottom. He's in Paris from 1784, 1789. He sends Maria. Sally Hemings, unbeknown to Jefferson, accompanies Sally Hemings. And the girl is shipped to England first. The Adams, with Abigail Adams meeting the child. Abigail falls in love with Mary Jefferson, who's 8. Sally Hemings is 14 at the time. And Abigail writes 2 letters. I'll only have one here. The girl Mary has with her, Sally, wants more care than the child. It is wholly incapable of looking properly after her without some superior to direct her. This and the other letter tell us, if we take Abigail Adams as a credible source, she's not a liar, that Sally Hemings was more immature than Mary, who was 8. I take this very seriously. So if she's behaving at a level underneath an 8-year-old child when she's 14, so Jefferson's going to fall madly in love with that? That's ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. All right, and fourth, this is another historical direct testimony by Jefferson slave Isaac Jefferson. And he's talking about Jefferson's brother Randolph, and who probably looked a lot like Thomas. I have a book on Randolph coming up soon. He says, old master's brother, Mass Randolph, was a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle and dance half the night, had much more sense than Isaac. What this tells us is that whenever Randolph came to Monticello, and he probably visited quite often, he was only 22 miles south of Monticello on his plantation, Snowden, which I visited not long ago. All the people of Snowden, it's funny, the people who live right where Randolph lived on the Snowden plantation, the people who own the land don't even know who Randolph Jefferson was. I find it kind of amusing. This testimony places Randolph at the scene of the crime. He's hanging out at the slaves' quarters. We have no testimony that shows Jefferson did that. Randolph is at the scene of the crime. If he's singing and dancing half the night and doing so often, he's a candidate for the paternity of Eston Hemings. This is, to me, the single most important piece of evidence. Randolph's at the scene of the crime. I think Randolph was the father of Eston. That's why he had the Jefferson Y chromosome. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, married, talked to her husband. She writes, this is indirect testimony. It's after the fact. It's of no greater weight than Madison Hemings' 1873 testimony. Mr. Southall and brother Thomas Jefferson Randolph, young men together, heard Mr. Peter Carr, Jefferson's nephew, who was living with Jefferson at the time because his father died when he was 30. Jefferson took in all the Carrs as his own sons and daughters. Peter Carr say with a laugh that the old gentleman has to bear the blame for his and brother Sam's misdeeds. If this is credible, we don't know how it's credible, but if this is believable, then we know that the brothers Carr were linked with Sally and Sally's sister. Another, Henry Randall, the first early biographer of Thomas Jefferson, has a quote about the Carrs, where one Carr says to the other, you and I, a couple of pretty fellows to bring this disgrace on poor uncle who has always fed us. We ought to be blanked by blank, whatever words, epithets you can use. So we have another bit of indirect testimony that implicates the Carr brothers. Ellen Randolph Coolidge, granddaughter. Jefferson loved her dearly. She was a very highly intelligent woman. And she says to the effect that whenever Jefferson released the slave had to have 2 qualities. One is light skin, pass for white. The other was you had to have a task, a craft, something you could do so that you could make a living. You could make it in white society, right? So here, I'm going to sum the evidence up. Big W is very weak, small w weak, W/S neither weak nor strong, small s strong, big S very strong. Let's look at the biological evidence. Let's go back over this. On the left, the hypothesis that Jefferson fathered all the kids of Sally Hemings. Now, the DNA study shows Eston Hemings has the Jefferson line male chromosome. Yeah, that's true. That's strong, right? Jefferson could be the father. We can't throw that away. Okay, the DNA study rules out the Carrs in the paternity of Eston. The Eston Hemings did not have the Carrs genes, so the testimonies by the grandkids that said that the Carrs were involved in paternity of some of the kids might be false. With respect to Eston, it's definitely false because it has to be a Jefferson, not the Carr. That doesn't mean that the Carrs could not have had children with Sally, other children with Sally. Against the hypothesis, Thomas Woodson was not fathered by Thomas Jefferson. That was the first child that was born in 1790, presumably. I don't think such a child ever existed. I think it was a figment of the imagination of Madison, made to implicate Jefferson. Okay, so the DNA study shows Jefferson as a possible father of Eston, doesn't single him out. That's all we can say. So we have physical evidence that Thomas Jefferson might be the father. That does not single him out. It does not even show he's the most likely. Now let's look at eyewitness testimonies. Look on the left. There is not one, nothing. There is no eyewitness testimony that implicates Jefferson. Nothing. Zero. So in other words, with the historical evidence in the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, Gordon Reed, the scholar, everybody talks of this mountain of historical evidence that implicates Jefferson. They use this terminology. There's so much historical evidence. There's nothing that is firsthand testimony. No eyewitness, zero. While we have 4 particular instances of eyewitness testimonies here: Abigail Adams, testimony of Thomas Jefferson with respect to the Walker affair, slave Isaac Jefferson, right? That talks about Mass Randolph being in Mulberry Row and hanging out with the black people all night and singing and dancing. And then the testimony of Edmund Bacon that says Harriet Jefferson was not fathered by Thomas. So this to me is substantial. And if you go to Monticello's webpage, they sweep all this under the rug. It's laughable what they do when confronted with this issue. They say, well, this means nothing. I don't know how you do that when you have nothing on the pro side and 4 things on the con side, and yet you talk of your mountain of evidence. What do we have? Non-eyewitness testimony. Everything is founded on the testimony of Madison Hemings. It's a weak argument. There are a lot of false claims in the testimony. We know he didn't write it, right? Samuel Wetmore wrote it, who had a Republican paper, and the Republican Party was not the republicanism of Jefferson. He hated Jefferson, Wetmore did. And Madison Hemings would have been in his 60s at the time. He's down on his money. He could probably receive a hefty financial incentive for this testimony, right? So the leverage here is that with Gordon Reed, the African-American scholar at Harvard, she wrote a second book in 2009 or so, I don't remember, talking about the Hemings of Monticello. She goes into detail about Jefferson's relationship, 4 chapters. We know nothing about the relationship, and she gives us 4 chapters of storytelling of fiction. And of course, she wins the Pulitzer Prize and 17 other awards and gets awarded with a job at Harvard for writing fiction. It's the way the world is these days. Now, on the con side, we have Ellen Randolph's testimony, Henry Randolph's. I don't take, these are non-eyewitness testimonies. They don't mean too much to me. They're amusing. They should be taken into consideration, but they're not compelling. We got to go back to the other slide. Nothing on the left, 4 things on the right. All right, other evidence. Some of the arguments of Gordon Reed. Madison Heming is listed as the son of Thomas Jefferson in the census. We talked of that. The newspapers in Chillicothe say Eston Hemings resembled Thomas Jefferson. I explained that. I think that's probably true. And that could be easily explained if Randolph was the father of Eston. All freed slaves by TJ were in the Hemings line. They want to say, well, this is important because it shows you that Jefferson loved Sally Hemings. So he gave the family. Well, look, if Thomas Walker was the father of Sally Hemings, the same father of Jefferson's wife, wouldn't he show privilege to the Hemings? Because that was Sally Hemings' father, as well as Jefferson's wife's father. So in other words, Sally Hemings was the sister-in-law of Jefferson's wife. Okay, there are the oral histories of Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings. These really mean nothing because they're conflicting data. I don't want to talk about Fraser Nyman, who's the archaeologist at Monticello, comes up with a technical Bayesian argument, which is a complex equation, Bayes' theorem. I studied this when I was at University of Pittsburgh getting my PhD. It's a complicated argument that deals with a priori probabilities and a posteriori, after the fact probabilities. And he aims to show that there is a 99% chance that Jefferson fathered all the children when you plug in all the data into his equation. Now, how does he get that 99% probability that Jefferson's? No one can follow the argument because it's entirely mathematical. So they go, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on here. So he's the father. Well, I do know what's going on. And these algorithms are only as good as the data that you plug in. You plug in false information, you leave out other information, you're going to get your percentage that you want at the end of the day. And that's what happened. The names of Sally Hemings' children were after, people in Jefferson's house and so forth. That was common for slaves. It doesn't show anything. The last one I think is fairly interesting. Excuse me, is that Jefferson was present at Monticello roughly 9 months prior to the birthing of all the children. That's an interesting, bit of evidence, bit of data. But why wouldn't, when Jefferson comes home from the presidency, I'm sure his brother, would have come to visit him. He didn't always log into his account books when his brother visited, because his brother visited quite often. I talk about that in the book on Randolph Jefferson. On the con, there's a lot of lacks here. Lacks do not show anything specifically, but sometimes they're interesting. Any of you like the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories, Sherlock Holmes? You remember Silver Blades? And Sherlock Holmes says something to Watson. He says, there's an interesting, something interesting happened last night with the dog at night. And Watson or someone says, well, the dog did nothing at night. He didn't bark. And Holmes says, that's the interesting thing. Since he didn't bark, the person who perpetuated the crime was someone the dog knew. Sometimes lack of evidence is very interesting. Now, if Madison Hemings talks of him being the father of Jefferson was his father and father of all the children, why hasn't anybody else, why haven't his siblings corroborated it? No one did. And why does he take so long to talk about it 50 years after Jefferson's death? That's suspicious. There is next to no references to Sally Hemings in Jefferson's writings. The Jefferson did it people argue, well, that's because Jefferson could keep secrets really well, right? Third, no eyewitness testimony, no eyewitnesses to the intimacy between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings in over 40 years, right? Jefferson was involved in this relationship with Sally Hemings for 38 plus years. And during that time, and in France, if she stayed with Jefferson at Hotel Languedoc and had made love to her, no one ever saw one thing suspicious in 40 years. Isn't that weird? Something will happen in 40 years. Something. I've studied enough psychology. I've written 5 books on Freud, and Freud said I'm not a big Freudian, but he said, nobody can keep a secret if his lips are sealed. He betrays himself with his eyes, with his fingers, with something. And Jefferson, they get around this by saying, well, Jefferson and Sally Hemings were great at keeping secrets. I'll leave that, okay? Now, on methodologies, the historians are often very fond of saying that there's a rough historical census that Jefferson was the father. Is that true? Yeah. Why is there a consensus? Because Monticello, which is the single most important source for information on Jefferson, shoves this down your throat. You go to Monticello right now, you visit, you're going to hear about Jefferson fathering, and people are tired of hearing about it. That leads to a consensus. Does consensus prove that Jefferson was the father? No. Most of Gordon Wood, who's one of the great early American historians, agrees that Jefferson fathered, but he really hasn't investigated. He says all you have to do is go read Annette Gordon Reed's Powerful Arguments. Doesn't tell you what those are. It's clear he doesn't really care about it. So he just says, well, Gordon Reed did this. She says it's fine, and that's okay with me. A lot of times the consensus is just because another thing is people don't want to step on Gordon Reed's shoes, because if you say, as I've said, that she's a charlatan, and I think she is, you get called a racist. I really don't care what you call me. I'm an old timer. I was schooled in philosophy, and I think history ought to be based upon facts, not fiction. And if that's going to get me blacklisted, then I really don't care. But I'm an old school. I'm a von Rankian. I think history, you build historical narratives on facts, right? Not fiction. Okay, secondly, they take Annette Gordon Reed as an unimpeachable source. In other words, she is standing on a platform. You can't disagree with her. And if you do, of course, you're a racist. You can't do that with any historian. That's not how you do good history. I've been very highly critical. She refuses to debate me. She won't even acknowledge me. She doesn't need to. She's rich. And she would have nothing to, she would win the debate, I tell you anyway, because I would be looked upon as an in-your-face, long-haired white Cossack scholar, and I would lose the debate because, oh, you're so mean. You're using logic and you're tearing her argument apart. They say that the argument against Sally Hemings, Jefferson's paternity, is too weak. I've just showed you it's not weak at all. There are no alternative hypotheses. That's false. We'll see. They assume Sally Hemings had not more than one lover. In other words, the Carrs can't be involved with the other ones because she didn't have more than one lover. Her mother had 4 lovers, 2 black, 2 white, and 12 children. Right? If her mother was not monogamous, why do we have to think that the daughter was monogamous? We don't know. Maybe she was, but you can't just assume she wasn't. Okay. And lastly, Gordon Reed's assertion that the 1783 testimony is not taken seriously because he was a black person. Not because it's indirect testimony, but it's because of being black. That's, to me, is not good. I'm just going to skip down to competing hypotheses. Now, there are some interesting counter hypotheses or alternative hypotheses. The hypothesis RJ, Randolph Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings and the other children. So Randolph Jefferson. That would explain why Eston looked like Thomas. If Randolph looked like Thomas, we don't know what Randolph looked like, to be honest. But brothers oftentimes, especially, you're an older crowd, I'm an older scholar. I notice as I get older, I start looking a lot like my brothers, whether I like it or not, or they like it or not. So that would explain a lot. They refute that, we do have that testimony that Randolph by Isaac Jefferson, the slave, that old Master Randolph used to hang around the slaves' quarters. Well, he could be the father, right? They don't even allow for the possibility, which is really bad scholarship. 2, Sally Hemings' children, the Sally Hemings not monogamous hypothesis. Sally Hemings had more than one father, right? The children had more than one father. I found out when I looked at the evidence of going back to Chillicothe, when they do a census, Eston Hemings, the one who looked like it, was 6'1". Thomas was 6'2.5". Madison, who does the report, was 5 feet 6 inches, much shorter than his younger brother. I have a friend of mine, John Works, who's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, doing DNA research right now of the type you see on genetic sites, has compelling evidence that Madison Hemings was fathered by Peter Carr. He's afraid to publish it. Actually, I just talked to someone about forcing him to publish his data. He's afraid of being called a racist. But we need to know what's on the line here. You have a lot of ancestors of Sally Hemings in that line being told by people at Monticello, Jefferson's your father. That's morally irresponsible if he was not. You're not even saying Jefferson could have been your father. You're saying Jefferson was your father. We don't know. You have no business saying that. Why do they do that? Cha-ching, money. They make millions of dollars in grant money. By the way, in 2018, that year, they spent $40 million and made 20 million. So they're 20 million in the red. In 2019, when they came out with this story, 2018, the next year, they made 70 million and had 40 million in expenses. So they improved their profits by 50 million, right? Because Jefferson definitely fathered, it's a fact. So they're making money, and then the grant money comes in, right? To tell the story. And that's all you hear at Monticello, Sally Hemings. Okay, we have the oral tradition. His mother, I said, was not monogamous. She had 12 children and 4 fathers. We can't assume she was monogamous. I don't have too much more to go here, and I'll be happy to take all your questions, and as long as we stay to the text here. Now, the Monticello, Gordon Reed, and the pro-paternity people are always fond of using in philosophy called the argumentum ad ignorantiam, which means schematically there's no evidence for a claim P, so the contradictory claim is true. If there's no evidence that P, then not P must be true. Here, an example. There's no evidence that another relative of Jefferson fathered all of the children, so Jefferson fathered all the children. I hope you see readily this is a really bad argument, right? If for example, when we use eliminative reasoning, by the way, that we don't get what we want to get. If I say A, B, or C committed a crime, and someone shows me that A and B didn't commit the crime, I can rule them out, but I can't conclude that C committed the crime unless I know for a fact that A, B, or C committed it. The fact that out of 3 candidates I rule out 2 is not marshaling positive evidence that the third did it. This is similar, a sort of a fallacious argument that, you know, if there's no evidence for some positive claim P, right, then we must assume that the denial, not P, is true. But no evidence is no evidence. No evidence can't support P. No evidence can't support not P. No evidence is no evidence. It supports nothing. Okay, and I'll give you some examples here. Ned Gordon Reed. In the absence of any contemporary source suggesting that another relative might have been the father, or any present-day indication that it might have been someone else, such speculation seems a desperate attempt to absolve Jefferson at all costs. In other words, we have no evidence that anybody else was the father, so we can't absolve. We have to implicate Jefferson. But she doesn't address the issue that we have no evidence that Jefferson is the father. All we have is DNA evidence that shows Jefferson could have been the father, but it shows Randolph could have been the father. Randolph had 4 sons, 3 of which were of an age that they could have been the father, you know, of Sally Hemings' kids. So 3 of his children could be implicated. So I think it's Randolph or his children. All right, breakdown. Look at the key on the bottom. C is a car, Jefferson's nephews. A is another relative of TJ. So we have a car, Thomas Jefferson, or another relative fathered all of the children. There's no evidence of another relative. That's false because we have Randolph Jefferson visiting. So C or Thomas Jefferson fathered. The 1998 DNA study showed that the car did not father Eston. Of course, it doesn't show anything else other than that. So Sally, and then we had Sally was monogamous. So Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. A sort of torturous deductive argument, twisted because the premises are false. Joe Ellis, if you're part of the Confederate South, as your group is, you're used to lost cause rhetoric all the time. You're probably tired of hearing that anybody who's, you know, as a frequent contributor to Abbeville all the time. I'm not a Southerner, but I'm interested very much in Southern culture. I live in Virginia right now. And you know, Southerners are always accused of, you know, a lost cause. Why is that? Because a lot of times the Northerners who write history fail to recognize that Southern culture is radically different than Northern culture, whether you like it or not. It's stratified, different style of living, different DNA. A lot of the people, as I talked with Bill, a lot of the people in the South were descendants from Irish people, Welsh people, Scottish people. Not the case in the North, settled by English people. So the fight you had in England between the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish And the English people might have been transferred just down to the early United States between the southern people, the ones who, the Irish, Scotch, and Welsh, and the English northern people. So there was a precedent for, why the cultures were so different. Joe Ellis, who believed that Thomas Jefferson didn't father until the DNA came out. Then he says, oh, now we know, yeah, he was. He says, why are we talking about Randolph as the father? He says, he is brought forward now because he fits the genetic profile. In other words, he has the Jefferson Y chromosome. Historians of the lost cause syndrome will recognize the poignant fusion of sincerity and futility at work here. In other words, we have no reason to bring Randolph in other than the fact that he fits the genetic profile. We're doing it because it's lost cause. We want to defend Jefferson come what may. No, you're wrong, Joe. You want to debate me on this? I'll gladly do it. We're bringing Randolph into debate because we don't know that Jefferson was the father. Randolph could have been the father, and if you do history honestly, you study all possible candidates. It is our obligation to look at all the evidence, not to pick out Thomas Jefferson because he's convenient. They call it the simplest explanation. And what that just means, it's the easiest. We can implicate Jefferson, call him a racist, sexist pig, and then get on with their lives. I don't do history that way. I want to make sure. Ellis's argument is pretty bad here. There's no lost cause. He fits the genetic profile, and that's why we're looking at it. We need to. So conclusions here, wrapping up. What do I think? I think more than likely Randolph Jefferson or one of his children was the father of Sally Hemings. That explains the resemblance. That explains the Jefferson Y chromosome. We have that direct testimony of Slay's Isaac Jefferson. I think it's likely that Sally Hemings had more than one lover. The foundation, without any real substantial evidence, why do they assert that it's a fact? It's politics. It's revisionism. It's progressivist ideology. Progressivist historians existed in the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s. These are people who say there's no truth to history. Since there's no truth to history, what we do is we use history to attack political problems like racism, postmodernism, revisionism, political. It's all politics, and I dare say, I hate to say, it's about money, right? We can destroy Thomas Jefferson, destroy this country as well, and money. I found it funny that you all know about the 1619 thesis, right? That America was founded by white racists, not by the founding fathers. Now, the people who came up with this thesis, they're so worried about Black Lives Matters and all that. Why aren't they taking the money that the millions that they're making from this research, this quote unquote research, and donating to Black Lives Matters or donating it to programs where they're helping solve race? They're not. They're stuffing their pockets with the millions of dollars. So I find that disgusting. And I have two more slides and I'll take questions. I have on YouTube, I have two things I do once a week. I do One Work, Five Questions, where I look with Donna Vitek and Dave Dietrich, who is a docent at Poplar Forest. By the way, I'm banned from Poplar Forest too. Last time I went there, they almost threw me in jail for doing nothing other than the fact that they don't like me there. And the real Thomas Jefferson. And I'll say next Friday, we're going to be, if you're interested, if you contacted me at my Hotmail, I'll put you on a mailing list, and I'm going to do every 2 weeks a very in-depth look at Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings with the real Thomas Jefferson. Starting with next week, it'll be the DNA evidence. We're going to be looking at the DNA study in 1998, and then weeks after that, going piecemeal at other stuff. And again, these are the two books that I've written. If any of you are interested, if you contacted me in my Hotmail for $30, including shipping, I will autograph a copy of either book. I have 3 on the left and 5 on the right. So for any of you who are interested in those, that's all I have here. I thank you very much, and I'll be more than happy to, I'll close this down and take this, be happy to take your questions right now.
Okay, do we have any questions?
No, why don't you direct them. And if you want, please come up, you want to come up to the screen so I can see you closely and tell me your name. And you guys have a good dinner there?
Oh, yeah, it's great. Okay.
I missed Tex-Mex food.
Back up.
Right about there. There you go.
Okay. My name's Andy Keaton, and my question is, my mother, who was in the DAR, said that it was his nephew. And from what you're telling us, that could possibly be true because they were close in age and the common Y chromosome.
The nephew doesn't have the common chromosome. No, that's a Carr brother.
Okay.
Yeah, but it could be Peter Carr simply because we have indirect testimony that implicates the Carrs, and there is new DNA research on Madison Hemings that shows the Carr, the nephew. Remember, the nephews lived with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was born in 43. From 73 on, they lived with Thomas Jefferson till they're old enough to move out because their father died, Jefferson's best friend, Dabney Carr.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Like the beard, by the way.
Well, thank you. And for your friends at Monticello, there's racism and then there's reality.
Yeah. You know what? Thank you. Let me just add, I'm all for, working to solve racial problems. I'm not for lying to do it.
Amen.
And if we have to die, and I will add, why are we picking on Thomas Jefferson more than any other founding father? Anybody have an idea?
Because he wrote the Declaration and the Constitution.
And he owned slaves.
He wrote the Declaration. He was in my estimation, I've written 27 books because I'm fascinated by the man. He had a mind like an encyclopedia. And I think for let's call them the fascists at Monticello, the revisionists, the radical woke people. I'm not right or left, by the way, but I hate what the woke people are doing to this country. I think what they're doing is, if we can topple Thomas Jefferson, he's our greatest founding father, in my estimation, easily. If we can topple him, the rest are easy. Why are they going after that? Who knows? I just think it's, I read a Ukrainian historian was talking about how the country was initially thought to be this wonderful melting pot of cultures. So as part of its, the American cultural ethos was a melting pot. We willingly bring people in so long as you learn our language and you adopt our history. Now we have embraced multiculturalism, which means we don't give a damn about the founding fathers and the truth about it. You can tell whatever stories you want. That's a disintegrative, right, a way of doing history. Thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
Okay, anybody else?
Could you put
Here,
well, it's asking if you put on the screen where it showed the two books.
Can you put on the screen where you showed the two books?
Yeah, I have to share screen again. I'm not so computer literate, by the way, either, you guys. You have to know that. I'm not great at stuff. How's that?
There you go.
The one on the right is the one that's the lecture I gave, or the talk I gave today is mostly drawn from that. And I was astonished by, it's just so obvious that there's no evidence pro Jefferson's paternity. And yet it's so easily believed by everyone. And these people are not stupid. So why are they buying into this garbage? What I did is what I just did to you. I put all the evidence pro and con side by side. When you do that, you realize they don't have an argument. So, and they know they don't have an argument. I know the people there. They don't care that they don't have an argument. Their argument is, we're champions of civil rights. We're helping Black people have an identity, right? That's all they care. Gordon Reed went on record saying, people are complaining at Monticello that all we talk about is race, 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 and Sally Hemings. And she went on to say, if you don't like it, it's too bad. We're going to shove it. She said, in effect, not in exact words, we're still going to shove it down your throats because we have to improve race relations. What about the truth? As a philosopher, I graduated from the #2 philosophy department in the country. When I wrote garbage, my professors destroyed me. Integrity was so important. We've lost our integrity. Yes, sir. Tell me who you are.
Daryl Brewer. I'm the adjutant here at the camp. And to answer your question, I think it's to be able to destroy the Constitution. These people do not like the U.S. Constitution. So they'll do whatever they can. And you're right. I think they picked him because he wrote it. I mean, he was certainly one of the founding fathers. But my
He wrote
question,
the Declaration, the Constitution. He was in France when the Constitution, but he had an influence on the Constitution, certainly.
it's certainly based on it. And anyway, so these two books are $30 a piece, and you'll autograph them.
That includes shipping.
So I'll have to-
25 and $5 for shipping. I will autograph. I have I have 8 books in total. 3 of the one on the left. Yeah, and the one on the right is not as pretty, but the arguing is pretty tight. The one on the right is pretty much the talk I gave. The one on the left looks at all the other major players like Peter Onuf, Gordon Reed. I look at their arguments and I completely destroy them. And I can say that I'm a philosopher, I'm a logic professor. It is very easy for me to spot bad reasoning. I was trained to do so. And yet, so those 2 books are for sale. I'll be happy to autograph and put a quote in from Thomas Jefferson for any of you. Yeah, you're right. Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and something you people don't talk about. There was a long passage in the list of grievances. There are about 18 to 22 grievances where Jefferson is blaming King George III for all the things he's done to oppress the colonists. The last one is the largest, 169 words, where he talks about the institution of slavery. He blames the king for it, for bringing in the blacks. And he says, he unequivocally says, black people are capital M, capital E, capital N, calls them men. So many scholars say Jefferson did not believe that all men are created equal applied to blacks. In that passage, which was cut out by the Congress because they couldn't deal with slavery, unequivocally calls black people, men, meaning the equal rights apply to them as well. So people are not familiar with that or ignore it because they want to create a straw man and destroy Jefferson. You're right. I think we've got a dangerous element in this country, in idle young people with nothing to do. So they topple statues, blame the South for everything that's gone wrong in the country, and blame the founding fathers. Thank you. Anything else you want to add?
I'll email you tomorrow.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay, I'm going to back up where you can see my head. I'm Jim Adams.
Or you can sit down if you want.
Anyway, I'm Jim Adams. I'm commander of of this camp, and we thank you for coming. Your talk was very interesting, and we appreciate it. One comment following up on Daryl's comment. We believe that we, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, are in the front line right now of a systematic attempt to destroy our heritage, destroy our heroes, destroy our monuments, and it's just the first attack against the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and our founding fathers. And it's systematic, it's the direction they're going. And I've even heard the Wokies say, well, that Constitution doesn't mean anything to us because we didn't have anything to do with writing it. And they want to redo the Constitution and everything and change the government to fit their ideals and not ours, not the common people.
Well,
So,
what are their ideals? Because I don't know they have any.
Well, it's fascism, it's Marxism. That's what their ideals are.
Yeah, and they're talking about fascism and Marxism without having read, the fascist writers and the Marxists. I have completed 2 books on the Ukraine. I just finished one that's coming out later this year. It's called Whisk of the Red Broom, Stalin in the Ukraine, 1928-1933, the years of the famine. And when you start reading the great socialism of Lenin and Marx, and you start reading, I told my book on Thomas Jefferson and liberty and equality. I have a book coming out shortly, and I just get the page proofs today. I have to make an index tomorrow. I look philosophically at Jefferson's concepts of liberty and equality, try to understand what he meant by them, and flesh out the philosophical implications. Jefferson was a radical liberal in many respects. And, you know, when I do my work on the Ukraine, I look at two former Ukrainians in the USSR who were kicked out of the country, went to escape to the United States, and, you know, Stalin was after them, trying to kill them. The first thing they mention is that you can't understand what it means to come to this country. When you breathe the air of freedom, he says, if you've never had freedom, when you first breathe it, I can't describe to you Americans how it feels and what it means. I put that in my preface, and one of my readers said, it's really quite moving, and it is. These idiots who are trying to destroy this country are using the very liberty we grant them to destroy the liberty. And they're doing it, like you said, from ignorance. They want to bring in socialism. They don't even know what that is. They need to do some reading.
True.
Do you want to add some more?
No, I just want to say again, we thank you, and we're going to be sending you a little memento of this occasion. And
Thank you.
And our adjutant will get that out. Maybe not as fast as the check to you for the 2 books, but he'll get it out.
Here's
Okay.
little Thomas. Here's little Thomas Jefferson. He's always got to be on there. He's always by me when I do a talk.
Thank you, Thomas.
He doesn't look anything like. Is that it? Well,
That's
thank you
it.
very much. And you know what? In answer to one of your questions about the futility of the sort of work you're doing, you just keep doing it and get some darn young people into the group if you can, to share your values and to carry on to the next generation, the richness of Southern culture and the richness of the stories about our founding fathers, okay? And founding mothers. I want to include the great women like Abigail Adams. Abigail kept John in line because I think he would have been a basket case without her. Thank you for having me.
Would be without our wives. Okay.
All right, take care, Mark.
Okay, I'll have the tape of this too available.
Thank you.